Alan Dershowitz came to debate. Jasmine Crockett came with lived truth, and what she said left the room stunned. The heat outside didn't stop people from lining up early. It was just after 6 p.m. in Tempe, Arizona, and inside Arizona State University's law building, the lecture hall was already packed, students shoulder to shoulder, a few professors leaning against the back wall, arms crossed. Local attorneys, reporters, and even a couple of retired judges filled the space. They hadn't come for a lecture. They came for a clash. The panel was titled "The Constitution in a Polarized America." Big names. Big egos sat at the far end of a long, polished mahogany table sat Alan Dershowitz, legendary attorney, Harvard professor emeritus, a man whose name carried decades of legal gravitas. Next to him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, younger, sharper, unapologetically direct. A rising political force with a reputation for cutting through pretense, moderator Professor Glenn Royce opened with a lighthearted nod about respectful disagreement, but you could feel it. This wasn't going to stay polite. Dershowitz leaned back, arms crossed, looking vaguely disinterested. Crockett sat upright, no notes in front of her, scanning the crowd with calm focus. For the first 20 minutes, it was business as expected, debates on judicial overreach, voting rights, and First Amendment interpretations. Crockett spoke plainly, powerfully, weaving legal insight with lived experience. Dershowitz countered with case citations and lofty historical references, relishing his own rhetoric, and then, the moment everything changed, Crockett was finishing a point about how constitutional interpretation routinely overlooks marginalized communities. She referenced a case she handled as a public defender, an undocumented teen facing mandatory minimums after an unjust traffic stop. Dershowitz smiled, but not kindly. The kind of smile that carries a knife. Well, he began. Turning toward her, Congresswoman Crockett clearly has a passion for storytelling. But this isn't drama class. It's constitutional law. While I admire her energy, I think we all understand there's a difference between courtroom anecdotes and actual jurisprudence. Perhaps if she'd spent more time studying and less time performing, we'd be having a different conversation. It landed like a slap. A beat of silence. A student stopped typing. A professor furrowed her brow. A woman in the third row muttered, "Wow." Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She adjusted her mic slowly, eyes steady on him. Then, with a voice low and unshaken, she began, "I didn't go to Harvard." "Never said I did," she said. "But I didn't need a marble library to learn the law. I practiced it every day in Dallas County. With real people. Facing real consequences. The kind you can't footnote. No sarcasm. No raised voice. Just cutting truth." The moderator attempted a polite interruption, a reminder to keep it civil, but Crockett kept going. "You can condescend all you want. I didn't come here to impress or resume. I came here to remind people that justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes, she's carrying 3 public defense files in one arm while trying to keep a mother's child out of jail for carrying a joint in the other." The room shifted. A couple of students leaned forward. A professor tilted her head, intrigued. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but Crockett wasn't done. "You want to talk about jurisprudence? Let's talk about how precedent is often built on exclusion. Who gets cited, and who gets silenced." "You're right, Professor. I didn't clerk for a Supreme Court justice. I spent that time in courtrooms where the AC barely worked, fighting to get a mentally ill woman out of a holding cell after she spent 2 weeks waiting for a competency evaluation that never came." The temperature in the room changed. She turned. "Not to grandstand, but to connect. Where I'm from, law doesn't live in books. It lives in breath. In fear. In desperation. In how fast you can get a hearing date before a mother loses custody of her kids. In trying to explain to a judge that trauma looks like defiance when you've never had a stable home." A law student near the back mouthed. Dershowitz stayed silent now, his earlier smirk gone. And Crockett pressed on, measured but firm, "I know your resume's impressive. But your experience doesn't cancel out mine. It doesn't override it. It's just different. And maybe if you spent more time in broken courthouses and underfunded clinics instead of television studios and marble halls, you'd understand, law isn't just theory to debate. It's a survival manual for people this country keeps forgetting. It wasn't anger that made the room fall quiet. It was how calm she was. How undeniable that a single clap broke out. Then another. Soon the room filled with real applause, not polite, not performative, but earned. Dershowitz picked up his water bottle, took a slow sip, and said nothing. Crockett turned back to the table. Still composed, and then, one last thing, you can question my education. You can question my approach. But you don't get to question my understanding of justice. I've lived it. I've fought for it. And I still do, every single day. The room stilled. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy with realization. The moderator eventually moved the conversation along, but the room didn't move on. Not really. Something had shifted. While the audience caught its breath, the internet was just getting started. Phones quietly lit up. A voice in the back whispered, "She just ate him alive." Not with malice. Without a law student in the third row turned to her classmate. "Did you get that on video?" She whispered, her hands still trembling, because none of them had ever seen someone challenge authority like that, not by shouting, but by standing entirely in her truth. And winning. By the time the panel was wrapping up, at least 4 different clips had already made their way to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Different angles, same caption, Jasmine Crockett versus Alan Dershowitz, and she left no crumbs. Back inside the room, Jasmine remained still. Face composed, notes untouched. If she felt anything about what had unfolded, it didn't show. Dershowitz, for his part, stayed silent for the next 20 minutes. The moderator clumsily tried steering the conversation towards something safer, campaign finance reform, dry and uncontroversial, but the energy in the room had shifted. Students whispered behind laptops, a few barely pretending to take notes. Heads down watching the video that was already rocketing across social media. One clip had nearly 300,000 views, and the night's event wasn't even over. Backstage, in a cramped side room behind the lecture hall, Chandra Patel, a junior producer for a Phoenix-based legal podcast, turned to her audio tech. "Scrap tomorrow's interview," she said. "We're covering this. The whole country's gonna be talking about it by morning." And she was right, because it wasn't just what Jasmine said, it was how. No theatrics, no shouting, no insults. Just steady, unflinching truth born of lived experience, the kind you couldn't counter with citations or dismiss with credentials. Back in the room, that shift became impossible to ignore. Older panelists who'd previously spoken with casual authority now glanced in Jasmine's direction every time they opened their mouths. Measured. Careful. The tone had been reset. One professor from Tucson tried to push back on legal precedent. Regarding Miranda rights, his tone polished and academic. Jasmine's reply was steady, personal, loaded with real-world examples of coerced confessions and broken legal trust in marginalized communities. The professor backed off with a polite, "Fair enough." Because the power dynamics had changed. This wasn't about resumes anymore, it was about credibility. And Jasmine had taken it. Even some of Dershowitz's loyal admirers in the crowd, students who'd spent years quoting his articles and admiring his courtroom exploits, sat quieter now. Not out of betrayal, but because they'd just been reminded that greatness isn't always something announced by titles or accolades. Sometimes, it arrives in plain clothes, with nothing but resolve and truth. Dershowitz, for all his storied career, had misread the room. He saw Jasmine as a challenger, not a peer. And in front of live cameras and an unfiltered audience, he bet on elitism and lost to experience, and still, Jasmine didn't gloat. No smug remarks, no indulgent smiles. She sat with the same quiet composure she'd brought in. And somehow, that quiet confidence said more than any post-debate victory lap ever could. As the panel officially closed, the moderator offered closing thanks. The obligatory applause followed, a polite, professional. But nobody moved, and when Jasmine finally rose to gather her things, the real applause came. Loud, sustained, undeniable. Not performance, not empty courtesy, respect. Earned. The old-fashioned way. One woman in the front row, burnt orange blouse, jeans, eyes shining, leaned over the railing. Thank you for saying what most of us didn't know how to, she said softly. Jasmine gave a small nod. Thank you for listening. But the night wasn't over. Not when the story outside those walls was just getting started. Out in the hallway, the air had cooled, but inside the heat of what had happened clung to the walls. Normally, post-panel chatter revolved around business cards, book suggestions, and dinner plans. Not this time. Groups of students huddled around phones, refreshing Twitter and Instagram. One clip, Jasmine calmly dismantling Dershowitz, had already hit 1.2 million views. Another version had subtitles. A third was set to Kendrick Lamar's DNA. The moment had left the room and become something bigger. Even some of the more buttoned-up professors whispered among themselves, not with disapproval, but with the quiet recognition that they'd just witnessed something they'd be unpacking for a long time. And Jasmine? No entourage. No media team. No handlers. She exited exactly as she'd entered, alone, briefcase in hand, expression steadied. A small group of undergrads waited nervously near the door. They weren't starstruck. They were just grateful. One of them, a quiet first-year named Dominique Rowe, spoke up. I'm not even in law, I'm poli-sci. But what you said, the way you said it, it's the first time someone like me felt like we belonged in a room like this. Jasmine smiled gently, asked her name again, repeating it carefully. Dominique, keep speaking your mind. Especially when people pretend not to hear you. That's when it matters most. Across the hall, Dershowitz was still at the panel table, moderator beside him making forced small talk. He scrolled his phone, expression tight. He'd faced criticism before. Plenty of it. But this wasn't political. It was personal, and it wasn't just the crowd. The shift had snuck up from the back corners of the room, from the very people who'd come siding with him, now wrestling with something unexpected. Backstage, a former appellate court clerk named Lauren Stein sat by the catering table, arms crossed. She spoke to no one in particular. She didn't just check him. She reminded us we've been gatekeeping the law like it's a country club. A nearby sound tech chuckled, and did it in heels. But the most important shift wasn't on stage. It was in the room. And in the people carrying that moment out into a world that would, by morning, no longer be able to ignore it. It didn't happen with shouts or slammed fists. It happened quietly, in people's heads, like a door opening to a third-year law student named Rami Vega, who'd long admired Dershowitz for his relentless courtroom style, felt something twist in his stomach. He lost before she even finished her second sentence, Rami muttered under his breath. Not because she was louder, but because she was right, and for Dershowitz, this wasn't just another debate or an academic disagreement. It was a generational reckoning. Prestige, tenure, and legacy still held value, but their weight had shifted. In the presence of something raw, human, and undeniable, those old credentials began to feel a little lighter. By then, national media had caught wind of the clip. Hashtags like #Crockett Clapback and #Real Justice Talks trended within hours. Pundits scrambled to frame it, to soften it, to spin it. But the footage didn't need anyone's commentary. You didn't have to know Jasmine's résumé to feel the moment. You didn't need a law degree to understand that what had just unfolded was bigger than any panel topic. It was about who holds authority, and who the world finally starts. To hear it back on campus, Jasmine paused by a vending machine near the law library. Alone for a moment, she dropped coins into the slot for a bottle of water. An older janitor with graying hair passed by and gave her a knowing look. "Damn good," he murmured. She smiled softly. "Thank you." But the most important reactions weren't happening in that building. They were unfolding in living rooms, on group chats, in late-night phone calls, between friends. By midnight, the clip had made the jump from legal Twitter to national headlines. Outlets like Phoenix Journal, USA Report, and Rolling Weekly ran pieces with headlines like "When Credentials Backfire in Crockett's Calm Storm." What began as a tense exchange in a university lecture hall was now a national conversation. And it wasn't about Dershowitz anymore. It was about who gets to define expertise, and who's been left out of the conversation for far too long. Jasmine hadn't set out to go viral. She hadn't rehearsed a takedown. But she had their attention now, and her words were growing louder with every repost and rewatch. That evening, in a quiet corner of a hotel bar, she sat with her longtime friend Marlene Yeager, a fellow attorney who'd flown in for the event. "You know what you did, right?" Marlene asked, stirring the lime in her drink. "You didn't just defend yourself. You exposed him." Jasmine stared out the window, fingers loose around her water glass. "I wasn't trying to expose him," she said quietly. "I just wanted them to hear the people he never sees." Marlene smiled. Same difference. Earlier that day, Jasmine had arrived with notes, printed citations, and highlighted case law. She never opened them. When the moment came, none of that mattered. What mattered was speaking from lived experience, raw and unpolished, in a way no credential could dismiss. Dershowitz, for all his courtroom triumphs and academic accolades, wasn't ready for that kind of testimony. He could argue case law. He could challenge precedents. But he couldn't discredit a public defender who'd sat beside teenagers behind plexiglass, held mothers' hands in holding cells, and negotiated pleas for men too poor to fight a broken system. The next morning, interview requests flooded in from over a dozen networks. Most were politely declined. Jasmine wasn't interested in chasing a headline. What meant more to her were the messages piling up in her inbox: young black women in law school, public defenders in rural counties, paralegals, social workers, even former clients. Each message carried the same refrain: "You said what we've been trying to say." One note stood out. From Talia Ron, a woman Jasmine had defended years earlier. "I don't know if you remember me. You helped get my probation dropped in 2014. That night, I almost gave up. But you kept calling. You stayed late. Watching you last night reminded me. You weren't just doing a job. You were fighting. You still are." Jasmine read it 3 times. Meanwhile, Dershowitz issued a brief, stiff statement to a reporter outside the Biltmore Hotel. "I didn't intend to offend the Congresswoman. I was merely questioning the framework of her argument, not her career." But it was too late. The damage wasn't in what he said, it was in what it revealed. An instinct to dismiss voices that didn't look like his, built from paths he never had to walk. And this time, people noticed. Within hours, the legal community reacted. A constitutional law professor from UC Irvine published an op-ed titled "When Elitism Meets Reality," writing, "Jasmine Crockett did more for public trust in the justice system in 5 minutes than most legal institutions manage in 5 years." That sentence alone was shared thousands of times. Still, Jasmine didn't celebrate. "I didn't win anything," she told Marlene later. "I just reminded them I belong in the room." Marlene leaned in, her voice steady. "No. You reminded them the room was always too small." And by then, it wasn't just about Crockett or Dershowitz anymore. It was about every courtroom and community the legal system had overlooked. Cable panels couldn't stop dissecting it. Commentators praised Jasmine's composure, critiqued Dershowitz's condescension, but the loudest voices came from people who'd never spoken up before, everyday folks who watched a clip and felt something crack open. In Tulsa, first-year law students organized a discussion. In Seattle, a high school civics teacher scrapped his lesson plan to play the video and ask his students what credibility really meant. In Mobile, Alabama, a judge quoted Jasmine's words while considering a sentencing motion. The moment had escaped its origin story. It had become a reckoning, and at the center of it was a woman who hadn't raised her voice once. A late-night host aired the clip during his monologue. Not the entire debate, just the part where Jasmine said, "Justice doesn't always wear a robe." The studio audience didn't laugh. They went quiet. Then came the final line, the one nobody could stop quoting: "I didn't have to clerk for a Supreme Court justice to understand justice. I lived it. I fought for it. And I still do, every single day." That wasn't a comeback. It was a mission statement, and across the country, people didn't just hear it. They felt it. Rewrite lately, people weren't giving answers, they were asking questions. One message read at 9:53 p.m., "I used to think experience was a bonus. Now I realize it's the foundation. Thank you for shaking something loose in me, Jasmine read that line more than once. Outside her window, the city hummed, lobbyists hurried along the sidewalks, a press van idled by the Capitol steps. But Jasmine wasn't thinking about politics. Or clips gone viral. She was thinking about the women she'd sat beside in courtrooms, no cameras, no applause, only quiet battles for freedom. She remembered Miss Nadine, a 62-year-old grandmother. Arrested after unknowingly bouncing a check trying to buy groceries for her grandkids. Jasmine had fought hard for her, spending 3 late nights preparing arguments. The judge gave Miss Nadine community service and a financial literacy course. Jasmine would never forget how she cried, not from relief, but because, for once, someone took her story seriously. That was what Jasmine's words had always been about. Not winning. Not arguments. Being heard across town, Dershowitz gave a lukewarm podcast interview. His voice lacked its usual sharpness, sidestepping Jasmine's name and retreating into abstract theory and respectful debate. The hosts prodded. But it was obvious, something in him had cracked. The illusion that legacy alone entitled a person to authority had been punctured. And now, everywhere he looked, people were asking how many voices had been ignored in deference to prestige. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed silent. She turned down interview requests from 3 major networks that week. It wasn't about shying from the spotlight, she simply knew the moment wasn't hers anymore. It had moved through her and now belonged to something bigger. One evening, walking through her Prince George's County neighborhood, she passed a group of teens heading to the store. "Hey," one girl called out, "you're that congresswoman, right? You went viral." Jasmine smiled. "I guess I did. I liked what you said about living justice." Jasmine paused. "Good," she replied. "Because it's yours too." But even as the moment settled, something else was gathering. New questions. Deeper conversations. A shift in who got to claim space at the table. By Thursday, the floodgates opened. Emails, voicemails, requests from morning shows, podcasts, roundtables. They all said the same thing: "We'd love to give you space to share more about your message." But Jasmine wasn't interested in sound bites. She'd said what mattered, once, clearly. Truth didn't need a rerun. Her chief of staff, Brent Hollow, wasn't thrilled. "You're missing a chance to control the narrative," he said, pacing her office, clipboard in hand. Jasmine didn't look up from her screen. "The narrative's already out there." Brent sighed. "If you don't shape it, someone else will." She pushed her chair back. "It's not about shaping. It's about showing. Let them talk, I've got work to do." It wasn't stubbornness. It was intent. She understood what Brent hadn't grasped yet. The moment's power wasn't in the spectacle. It was in its stillness. A quiet confrontation that resonated because it wasn't a performance. No theatrics. Just a mirror. Outside her office, the commentary churned. Think pieces piled up. Some called her too emotional. Others praised her for being grounded. One conservative columnist tried dismissing it as political theater, but his readers turned on him fast. They'd seen what happened. And no article could rewrite what they'd felt. In Lincoln, Nebraska, a law student named Maya Fields walked into her constitutional law seminar wearing a t-shirt that read, "Justice doesn't always wear a robe." Her professor smiled, nodded, and began class without a word. In Flagstaff, a civics teacher played the clip for his middle schoolers. Not to debate politics, but to ask, "What does fairness sound like?" A 7th grader raised his hand. She talked like someone who listens, he said, and that was the point. The conversation was stretching beyond law schools and news panels, reaching classrooms, kitchens, and courtrooms. Reshaping the idea of authority. Not granted by degrees, but earned. Through understanding. In Jasmine's office, business carried on. 3 housing policy meetings, a food bank visit, a sit-down with community leaders in Bakersfield about water rights. None of it made the news. But even without cameras, the people she spoke for were watching. One afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a note in careful, slanted cursive, I watched you speak. I'm 68. I've worked as a court clerk for 35 years. I've seen judges ignore crying mothers. I've seen lawyers fall asleep in court. What you said, about how the law lives in breath and fear, I've never heard anyone say that out loud. I cried. Thank you, she kept the letter. Not for her ego. For the reminder that silence was never an option. Back in Tempe, the university quietly scrubbed the panel clips from its site. Officially, it was a copyright issue. But students knew better. A few donors had complained. Not about shouting, there wasn't any, but about the tone. Too raw. Too direct. It didn't stop anything. The clips circulated anyway, subtitled. Remixed, interlaced with other moments of women speaking truth to power. A growing collage of testimony, and Jasmine? She kept working. No fanfare. No press run. She told her team to ignore the hashtags, the merch pitches, the branding offers. I'm not a meme, she said. I'm a mirror. And as the noise faded into background hum, something older began to stir. The past that shaped her voice wasn't done with her yet, long before microphones, panels, or congressional hearings. That it was coming back. There was room 14B at the old county courthouse in Garland, Texas. Back then, it smelled like sweat, mildew, and old paper. The ceiling tiles sagged, the vending machine hadn't worked in years, and the air always felt too still. That was where Jasmine cut her teeth, sitting on a stiff wooden bench, flipping through case files of people she'd just met 5 minutes before the judge called their names. One of those names was LaVon Darnell. 17 years old. Arrested for resisting arrest during a jaywalking stop. No priors. No drugs. Just a busted lip and bruises. The officer claimed LaVon tensed his shoulders. That was it. Jasmine sat across from him, knees nearly touching. He wouldn't look up, his gaze fixed on the floor, jaw tight. They said I swung, he muttered. I didn't even move. Her hands shook as she thumbed through his intake papers. She was new, months out of law school, and this was one of her first solo cases. The prosecutor offered a deal, 6 months deferred. No jail if he stayed. Out of trouble, LaVon looked up, confused and angry. I didn't do nothing though. And Jasmine had to decide, fight it and risk a trial in front of a hostile judge, or take the deal and keep him out of lockup. She took the deal. It kept him free. But it stuck with her. Not because it was the wrong choice, but because it was the only one the system left her, that stayed with her in every courtroom after, the weight of knowing that sometimes winning meant settling for survival. Years later, Jasmine kept a small folder in the bottom drawer of her desk at home. No label on it. Inside, old notes, photos, letters from clients who made it, and some who didn't. Handwritten thank yous on scraps of paper. Court dockets filled with frantic, penciled margins. She opened it from time to time, not to reminisce, but to stay grounded. There was Sonia Alvarez, working 2 jobs and missing a court date because her shift ran late. Jasmine spent 3 hours in line just to file the right motion to get the warrant lifted. And Tyrone Brooks, who broke down sobbing when a judge reduced his sentence and turned to Jasmine like she'd pulled off a miracle. She hadn't. She'd just shown up. She'd just listened. Those cases never made headlines. But they built her. They made her voice what it was, the reason the moment with Dershowitz hit like it did. Not because she was clever. Because she carried those rooms inside her. And when she spoke, you could feel their weight. Even now, Jasmine still dreamt of that courthouse. Not nightmares, just flashes, the sharp click of heels on cheap tile, a mother whispering please don't let them take my boy, the soft rustle of overstuffed case files in worn folders. It was why she never overestimated titles. Why degrees didn't impress her. Why panels like the one in Tempe didn't rattle her. Because if you've ever stood in front of a judge and argued for a stranger's freedom while the bailiff watched you like a hawk, you don't need anyone's permission to believe you belong in that room. And that belief? It shows. That's what people saw in her that night on stage, a steady, unforced certainty you can't fake. A voice shaped not by theory but by heat. By scared clients. By hard choices. Late one night, standing in her kitchen with a cup of tea, Jasmine scrolled through messages. One stopped her cold. A young woman from Boise wrote, "I didn't think someone like me could ever be a lawyer until I saw you speak." Jasmine set the phone down. That was the point. Not to impress. Not to perform. To hold up a mirror that said you can. You belong, but belonging wasn't the only question. It was who gets to decide what belonging even means. The divide had always been there, unspoken. Unchallenged. Prestige in one hand. Public service in the other. Rarely did both hold the same weight in the same room. Until now. In the days after the panel, law schools across the country held impromptu conversations. Not formal lectures, real talks. Heated. Awkward. Messy. But necessary. Students were finally asking aloud, what makes someone credible in this system? At the University of Arizona Law Center, a visiting professor froze the video frame as Jasmine said, "The law doesn't live in books. It lives in breath." Then he turned to his students. Which matters more, he asked. Case law, or the lived experience of the people we claim to protect? No one answered right away. In Madison, Wisconsin, a fourth-year student, Jonas Merritt, wrote a paper titled Theory in a Vacuum, directly calling out how elite legal institutions dismissed frontline practitioners as somehow less rigorous. He centered his argument on Jasmine's words, and in Santa Fe, a public defender named Shira Baldwin printed out Jasmine's quote and pinned it above the breakroom coffee machine. It wasn't hero worship. It was recognition. Resonance. People weren't just watching a moment. They were seeing themselves in it, and questioning why they'd been ignored for so long. But while the shift was exhilarating for some, it unsettled others. In academic circles, quiet resistance surfaced. Not open hostility, just discomfort. Some professors felt challenged. A few editorial writers tiptoed around it, suggesting Jasmine had blurred the line between anecdote and argument. One claimed she'd overstepped her role as a political figure by challenging academic norms. None of it stuck. Because people had already felt the truth in her words. And truth doesn't need credentials to hold its ground. Dershowitz faded further into the background. No apology came. Just silence. A handful of think pieces defended his legacy, but none could erase what people saw, a man leaning on status to dismiss someone who didn't flinch. That's what rattled people. Jasmine didn't posture. She didn't perform. She presented reality with surgical calm. And it forced people to reconsider what authority should look like. It wasn't about resumes anymore. It was about relevance. In a Zoom session with law students from Tempe, someone asked Jasmine what advice she had for young lawyers. She didn't hesitate. Don't wait for permission, she said. And don't confuse fancy words with moral clarity. The truth doesn't always sound polished. Sometimes it sounds like a public defender with 3 hours of sleep and 30 minutes to save someone's life. That hit hard. Because the line between prestige and public service had always favored one side. The side with the conference stages. The academic journals. The theory-laden panels, and meanwhile, the ones buried in bail hearings and eviction defenses barely got a nod until now. Until that moment, Jasmine's moment, the conversation had always belonged to other people. But as more people watched, shared, and reflected, something began to shift. A quiet understanding started to take root. Maybe the people closest to the pain should have been speaking all along. In Jackson, Mississippi, a civil rights attorney named Devin Traylor wrote in a local op-ed, "For too long, our profession has celebrated those who speak about injustice while ignoring those who speak through it." Jasmine Crockett reminded us that a resume is not a moral compass. That line stuck. Because it named what too many had quietly accepted, that prestige isn't neutral. It has a cost. And too often, that cost is the silence of the people who've actually felt the sharp end of the system. Jasmine hadn't set out to rewrite the rules. She came to show they'd never been fair to begin with. And while the legal world reeled, something subtler, but no less important, began to build, an invitation for people to reconsider where they stood, and who they stood with. 3 weeks had passed since the panel in Tempe, and though the headlines had moved on, the people who truly heard her hadn't. Because once you've seen something honest, something unvarnished and real, it doesn't leave you. It lingers. It reappears in conversations you weren't expecting, in choices you start to question. Jasmine hadn't spoken publicly about the panel since. She'd gone back to her routine, committee meetings, community visits, late nights reading briefs. At her kitchen table, a blanket over her lap, a pen tucked behind her ear. But one quiet Friday morning, after breakfast and a walk through her neighborhood, she sat down and wrote something. Not for cameras. Not for social media. A simple letter for her interns, her staff, and the young people who kept asking, how? Did you stay calm? This is what she wrote. When someone tries to define you by what you lack, remind them, gently, of what you carry. Remind them that experience is its own kind of education. That wisdom isn't confined to boardrooms or ivy halls. Don't chase applause. Don't rehearse lines for rooms never built for you. Speak plainly. From where it hurts. From where you've healed. And remember, there's more power in the truth you've lived than in the titles they hide behind. As she signed it with her initials, folded it, and set it aside in an envelope she'd address later. That was who she'd always been, not a performer, not a provocateur, just someone who refused to let others shrink her story to fit their comfort. In Oakland, a mother of two named Risa Lamand printed those words and pinned them above her kitchen table. She wasn't a lawyer. She worked at a dialysis clinic. But the words reached her anyway. In Little Rock, a legal aid office repainted its entry hallway and added Jasmine's quote in bold black letters above the waiting bench. Remind them, gently, of what you carry, because the message wasn't just about courtrooms or panels. It was about every room where people had been dismissed, talked over, or made to feel small because their knowledge wasn't framed by a diploma or broadcast from a stage. It spoke to anyone who'd ever been told they were too much of one thing or not enough of another. By month's end, Jasmine was asked to speak at a law school graduation in Cincinnati. She agreed, but only under one condition: no scripted introduction, no long resume readout. Just call her by name, hand her the mic, and when she stepped onto the stage, facing a sea of caps and gowns, she didn't recite advice from a textbook. She said, I don't know everything. But I know this: if you forget where you came from, the law will too. Don't try to sound smart. Try to stay human. For a beat, the audience stayed still. Not stunned, understood. And some of them would remember that line years later, sitting in courtrooms, in depositions, in back offices where they'd feel pressured to forget themselves. Back in Tempe, the lecture hall where it all happened sat quiet, largely forgotten by the institution that had hosted it. No plaque. No replay. Just a clip buried in an archive. But for the people who'd been in that room, who saw the moment live, unfiltered, unscripted, they would remember the exact second when something cracked open. When an assumption was challenged. When silence was broken, and truth weighed more than credentials, and they'd remember her. Not because she was loud, but because she was clear. Not because she came to argue, but because she came to tell the truth. Thought if there's one thing to take from it all, it's this: never let anyone tell you your story isn't enough. Not in court. Not in a classroom. Not at the dinner table. Not when you've lived it. Not when you've survived it. And especially not when they act like you don't belong, because sometimes, the most qualified voice in the room doesn't announce itself. It just speaks, and that matters. Real voices matter. Yours included.